Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization and our friends at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation with Blake Scott Ball and Gary Groth, part of our Arts and Culture series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, myths.org. Like everything at Town Hall, trust me, it's decidedly a work in progress. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts, any thoughts you may have, at the address that you'll see in the chat at the bottom. Tonight's conversation will run around an hour, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so please submit yours at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857. That number is also noted in the chat. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to hit as many as possible. So keep yours concise, and that'll enable that. For those of you who want to view the program with closed captioning, visit the CC button. I should say click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new programs every day. We'll be taking a hiatus over the summer to gear up for next season, but we have a few upcoming programs to round out this one. Emily Rapp Black in conversation with Lydia Yuknovich, examining how the experiences and art of another artist, in this case Frida Kahlo, can help shape our own lives. A virtual pre-launch of the youth-created Ground Zero Radio that'll be live from our Great Hall, featuring youth-created podcasting, community features, live interviews, and performances from local musicians. And one more event from our Great Hall, but this one with a live audience, featuring the extraordinary Johnny Kendrick, a subtle and sophisticated jazz singer, in an evening co-produced by our friends at Earshot Jazz. You can also view that one online if you're not quite ready to join us in the building. I can't imagine who that person is, though, who isn't just ready to join us in the building. But at any rate, you can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Our work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Arts and culture programs in particular are supported by For Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, the Norcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But finally, as most of you know, Town Hall is at heart a member supporter organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. Lastly, you will certainly want to know more about tonight's topic and dive deeper into the discussion. The easiest way to do that is to purchase your own copy of Dr. Ball's book through the link for Third Place Books. You'll find that in the chat as well. As we like to say, please keep your purchasing local, and maybe the things we love about the city from before the pandemic will be around to delight us on the other side. And with that, Blake Scott Ball is assistant professor of history at Huntington College, where he chairs the Department of History and Political Science. Before his current position, he served as assistant director for the New Summersole Center Public History Initiative at the University of Alabama. He's written several articles and book reviews that have been featured in the Alabama Review, Birmingham News, AL.com, and was an editor for the Southern Historian Graduate History Journal. Seattle-based Gary Groth is a comic book editor, publisher, and critic. He's editor-in-chief of the Comics Journal and co-founder of Fantagraphics Books, which he published in 1976, established, I should say, in 1976 with Michael Catron and Kim Thompson. Groth's Comics Journal is known for applying rigorous critical standards to comic books and graphic work. Groth also founded the Harvey Awards, one of the comic industry's oldest awards. Ball's new book, Charlie Brown's America, The Popular Politics of Peanuts, is the subject of their discussion this evening. In case you can't tell from my overly enthusiastic and effusive tone, this is how excited I am for tonight's program. This excited. Please join me in welcoming Gary Groth and Blake Scott Ball.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Blake, I'd like to begin by asking you a couple of questions about the why and the how of the book. So first of all, why did you choose to explore this subject? I should like to point out that I've read, given the time I had, I read most of the book. I'm going to be a little weak on a couple of chapters, but I'd like to say that there's appears to be a prodigious amount of research. So you've really done your homework. But why did you choose this particular subject? Why would a professor of history at Alabama choose this particular subject?
Well, I grew up loving comics and comic strips. I particularly remember reading and many times being confused by Charlie Brown and Peanuts. It threw me off as a kid because it wasn't always funny, or it wasn't always kind of as accessible as some of the strips I was more familiar with, like at that time, like Garfield. So Charlie Brown made me think. Charlie Brown made me curious, and that experience from childhood kind of always stuck in my mind. When I got to graduate school, I was really interested in, from a historian's perspective, studying how everyday people had experienced the events of the Cold War and modern American history. There was a whole lot of study of kind of big national narratives from the viewpoint of Washington, D.C., and organizational leaders and political leaders and big decision makers and things like that. But there was a kind of growing interest in what we call grassroots histories, of looking kind of from the bottom up and what the experience was like. And I was very curious whether pop culture could be a road for kind of accessing those broader popular experiences of these big changes in the world during the period. And so it was kind of a match made in heaven. I'd seen about the time that I was starting my doctoral work, the Schulz Museum was probably just a couple of years old, and was still growing at the time. And so I thought, you know what, this sounds like a lot of fun. It's an excuse to get out of Alabama and go see sunny California and do some research and some really fun documents. So while all my classmates were studying, dusty old government records, I was reading the funny pages.
That's a good reason. You touched upon my next question, which was your methodology for researching. How did you go about that? Because you have a substantial list of endnotes.
Well, first and foremost, the strip itself I saw as a historical source. One of the incredible things about Peanuts is that Charles Schulz starts it in the first Monday in October 1950, and it runs. It took about a year or so before they picked up the Sundays, but from there until February of 2000, it runs basically every day. And so I thought, what more kind of just incredible historical artifact than something that is kind of living every single day of these 50 years. So the strip itself was an important source. Charles Schulz's own words and writings were an important source for me. I wanted to understand as much as possible kind of his views and ideas and upbringing and experiences that were feeding into this. But then the kind of third and really, I think, key element of the story was the life of the strip after it left Charles Schulz's hand and became part of American culture. So for that, one of the crucial resources that I found at largely at the Schulz Archive, but I found pieces scattered across the country as well, were letters from fans. Some of them with names of no significance, all the way to fans named Ronald Reagan and Hillary Clinton and others who were writing outside, not in a sort of in a public venue, but writing privately, expressing private but deep concerns about various things that the ideas of the strip elicited in their mind. Gary, I think. Oh,
sorry.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
You just touched on something I wanted to remark on next, which was in your introduction. You write, and I quote, "One of the remarkable things about the strip," stated one interviewer in 1987, I think that was me, "is that there are no perceivable ideologies." I guess I was wrong. Schulz agreed. Quote, "Sort of a wishy-washiness," he chuckled. And then back to you. "Often the humble Midwestern cartoonists seem to deploy such statements as a defense mechanism to avoid staking a definite position on a controversial topic. But it was more than that. Wishy-washiness was his ideology. In practice, Schulz was sort of political chameleon, shifting left and right within the bounds of the broad middle of American political culture during the Cold War." So can you expand upon that and how you see the political beginnings of Peanuts taking shape during the Cold War, which was
Sure.
5 years old when it started?
Oh, sure. So I was struck from the very beginning of this project, and Gary, that was one of your interviews with Schulz, and
yeah.
I was struck by that moment in the conversation when he kind of jokingly, it seems, said that his politics were a bit wishy-washy, and it struck me because that was the way that that on a number of occasions Lucy referred to Charlie Brown, as kind of wishy-washy. He's a little bit of this, he's a little bit of that, but never fully committed. And the reality, as I explored the work of Charles Schulz, was that that he could be chameleon-like. He could certainly, there were certainly controversial topics he chose to tread into, but didn't necessarily stake out a clear opinion. He kind of left that up to the audience to read their views onto the situation. But then there were other places in his art and work where he kind of didn't pull the punch. He kind of would stake out exactly what he thought and take some strong positions, whether that was things like the Christmas, Charlie Brown Christmas special and Linus's scripture recitation, or it was the introduction of Franklin in the late 60s and early 70s, and his introduction into the classroom, things like that. Charles Schulz could definitely take strong positions. He had strong beliefs about things. But I think, one of the elements about Schulz that he emphasized throughout his career was that, he really had, at one point he claimed, I have two editors. I have the newspaper editors that are trying to sell papers, which is the job of his strip. And then he has the audience that's going to let him hear it if he missteps or goes in a direction they didn't like. And so
he was mindful of both.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's part of the real genius of Schulz, was his ability to navigate both, and know when he could push those relationships, push them to but also know when to be more subtle and sly in his approach.
Yeah. I mean, and to be cognizant of both and still retain his own voice and his own perspective, and maintain that integrity. Absolutely. That's an amazing balancing act over 50 years.
Right.
Now, your book is broken down into a handful of chapters. each of which takes a particular political subject, such as the environment, the Vietnam War, and theology. And so I just wanted to kind of go through a few of these and ask you to talk about them and elaborate on them. You said that you were referring to the new direction in Peanuts when he introduced theological subjects and biblical quotes to the strip. You said the new direction in Peanuts increasingly singled Schulz out as a Christian cartoonist and pop thinker. Can you talk a little about when he started introducing biblical quotes, and I guess how it became a little more aggressive about doing that as the strip progressed?
Yeah. Well, so Charles Schulz was not a particularly religious person growing up. From all accounts, he was sort of cognizant of the Lutheran tradition, but was not particularly active in that. It's really when he comes home from World War II that he feels very alone. His mother had passed away during his time in training, and his father had remarried, and he kind of had built-in friends in the Army, I think, and we see that he maintained some of the at least one of those friendships for years. Some of those letters are still at the Schulz archive. But back in St. Paul, Minneapolis, he doesn't have a lot of close friends, and so he's looking for connections, and he finds them by connecting with the minister who had preached at his mother's or officiated or done the service at his mother's funeral. And connects him with a kind of young adult Bible study group. And in this, he finds kind of a set of friends, but also a new passion for study, and particularly Bible study. And so he's pretty gung ho about this personally, but it doesn't really feature very prominently for the first several years of Peanuts. It's really not until there's a moment in the mid 50s where he attends. He does a visit to New York City for some meetings with his bosses at United Feature Syndicate, and while he's there, Billy Graham is at Madison Square Garden doing his famous New York City crusade in 1957, I believe. And so Schulz attends one of those meetings, talks to a number of his friends and associates about just how impactful it was, and how he was kind of struck by Billy Graham's charge that, if you really believe these things, then you shouldn't be reserved about telling other people about it or communicating that. And so around this time in 57, 58, we see Linus, who up to this point has been the junior character of the strip. He's Lucy's little brother. And the gag with Linus up to that point had largely been about him following around Lucy, and Lucy, kind of incorrectly explaining all the phenomenon of the world. And Charlie Brown gets a stomach ache because he just can't stand to hear the absurdity of it all. And over a series of Christmas strips, Linus begins to develop a voice of his own, and that voice is one of contemplating theological questions, contemplating what these kind of classic scripture verses might mean in the context of a modern world for a little boy in the late 50s. And so this continues to develop through all sorts of strange scenes, like, for example, when Linus shows off to his friends on the way to school his show and tell project, in which he had done a handmade replica of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including weathering the paper and doing the original Hebrew and all these sorts of things. Schulz loved to duplicate original text, whether music or other things in his strips. And but really the culmination comes in the whole episode 1965 of the Charlie Brown Christmas special, where Schulz is kind of roped into a project to do. They had already done some television commercials for Ford in the late 50s and early 60s, and the idea comes down the pike to do a full broadcast. So they want to do a Christmas special, and they've got some different kind of quirky ideas for it, like actual child actors for voicing the children, a jazz trio to do the music, and things like this. But one of the things that Schulz is insistent on as they're writing the script is that if we're going to talk about Christmas, let's be the ones to talk about the real meaning of Christmas. It's not just a celebration for Santa or for giving presents or for consumerism, but it has a traditional meaning. And there was concern, both among his associates and executives at CBS and Coca-Cola, who was the major sponsor, at the point of kind of seeing the finished product. They run the broadcast because all of the ad slots had already been sold, so they had to run. They were already committed to run it. They run the broadcast, kind of anticipating that it would fall flat, and the public response to it was so overwhelming that within a week they had already put it on the calendar to air again the next year, as well as inking a deal for 3 more Peanut specials to follow. Now, some of the response from fans on that had nothing to do with religion in particular, but they liked the fact that it was just family friendly. It was wholesome. It was kind of just innocent and delightful. But there was a strong section of fan response that honed in particularly on that message, that Schulz was willing to talk about Jesus and kind of the founding of the Christian faith right here in this national broadcast. Now, the interesting thing is, as the years went on, Schulz really continued to grow and evolve and think on these ideas. He never really, I don't think, lost his love for Bible study and for thinking about deep theological questions, but he did change his views on about how he as an artist might engage these ideas in the world, and liked to say that it was more important to kind of sit down and have a long conversation with someone about this than to just kind of throw these one-off ideas out there. But there was an audience that really from 65 onward, kind of a subculture of the audience that saw him as a sort of evangelical hero in American pop culture. Not really an accurate representation of who he was, I don't think, but that's certainly the way they perceived him, and that was very meaningful to that group of the audience.
Now, that 1965 broadcast, was there any backlash against his invocation of Jesus? Were there any negative consequences?
I did outside of some of the internal conversations. I did not find any negative or concerned references. I think the fact that he left the reference specifically to, Linus doesn't pontificate or analyze anything. He just strictly reads the scripture text, and so there wasn't any backlash. Although on the subject of kind of scripture references in the comic strips, Schulz often said the people who were most critical of things like that were actually Christian readers who didn't think that it was appropriate to reproduce scripture in the funny pages. They felt that was a bit sacrilegious.
Right. Well, that makes a perverse sense. So no atheistic backlash throughout his career over his injection of Christian.
Right. Surprisingly, not that I've found.
So how do you account for that? That there was no negative comments or no people who took offense at that. For injecting that into a comic strip.
Yeah, well, I think that you can, in particular with the Christmas special, I think that there's kind of a dual message in that program. I think for those who were particularly attuned to kind of the Christian message, they zero in on those couple of minutes at the end of the program. The larger message of the entire program is really in some ways similar to like How the Grinch Stole Christmas. That the idea is that you can't buy the fulfillment of the spirit of Christmas. It's that all of the fancy shiny things are not where the satisfaction comes from. So I think there in that case particularly there was probably enough enough of a kind of alternate message there or a dual message there that could move on. Now it could also be perhaps, and I don't know, it could also be that those angry letters didn't get saved quite as often. Although they saved a surprising number of angry letters. He seems to be have been entertained. It seems by some of those angry letters. He kept them hanging around for decades.
Is there any evidence that he either didn't mind the angry letters or actually enjoyed them? Is that?
No, other than, well, he does in some later interviews, he does remark kind of jokingly about some angry letters he received. I did have there's at least one case in the chapter about Franklin, the Black character. There is an instance where Schulz was upset enough by an angry letter that he actually wrote back to that to correct that fan. But typically he if he was going to respond, the responses I've seen were all very cordial.
Since you mentioned Franklin, why don't we skip ahead to the chapter on Franklin and Schulz's relationship to race in the strip. Now, there's an absolutely, I think, fascinating backstory involving the lobbying by a woman named Harriet Glickman. 41 years old, lived in Southern California, Black woman, I believe. And she wrote to Schulz and implored him to integrate the strip. And why don't you take the story from there? Because it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So Schulz, Harriet Glickman is actually a white woman, Jewish, but she has been writing. She's kind of on this crusade, this personal crusade to impact. She's just very. She says in later interviews, she said she's just very concerned about the state of pop culture, and especially the state of children's entertainment by 1968. And so she's writing to a number of different television creators and also cartoonists, and Schulz is one that she particularly keys in on. Writes this letter, implores him to expand the cast of Peanuts to include a diversity that would reflect America better. And Schulz writes back pretty sympathetic to her point of view, but says pretty kind of frankly, he says, I just don't think that I'm the right person to do this, largely because he feared that he would not be able to accurately represent a Black character's voice, and that anything he would do with a Black character would likely come across as patronizing or really misunderstand that viewpoint. And so he kind of demurs from that doing that. Well, Glickman, to her credit, doesn't stop. She continues lobbying. She must have sensed something there. And she says, okay, well, how about if because there are some, she was involved with a number of different organizations in Southern Florida, in Southern California, in particular for lobbying for housing equality. And so there were some groups that she worked with, some African-American families, and she invited them to write letters and to express in their own words what it would mean to their families, to their children, if Schulz were to integrate the strip. So they send those letters along, and they encourage him about how positive an influence this would be, how important it would be to have for it to just be normal that there is a Black child in the world of Charlie Brown. And that, in combination with some of the kind of very chaotic events of 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the turmoil going on in Vietnam, and the marches going on in Washington, D.C., Schulz does decide to introduce this character. He does it in a really remarkable way. Charlie Brown meets Franklin at the beach, and it's incredible because they're wearing nothing but swim trunks, and so there's a lot of skin exposed. There is no doubt the difference in skin color between these two boys, but yet Charlie Brown and Franklin become kind of instant friends. There is no awkwardness or reluctance between them. They build a sandcastle together, and it's really a nice exchange. Now, after that, it would take about 6 weeks or so before Franklin appeared again, to the point to where Schulz started getting letters saying, "What happened to Franklin? Where'd he go? Why hasn't he shown up?" And so Schulz actually moves Franklin into the neighborhood, and that was the point where things got a little more dicey for especially some of the Southern readership.
Yeah. Can you talk a little? Well, let me skip back just for a second. I do want you to talk about the Southern reaction to Franklin. But let me skip back to just how brilliant it was the way he introduced him, because comics being such a visual medium and Schulz being such a master of that medium and so knowledgeable about it, he introduced him on the beach. And my speculation is that the reason he did that was to make it absolutely unambiguously clear that Franklin was black, because if he just had his face, he could be Pigpenish or something like that. So he did that to make it very, very clear. That he was a black kid.
Absolutely. And there's actually
he must have really thought that through.
Yeah. Well, and that's so much Charles Schulz style. He's just extremely thoughtful and reflective, and that seemed incredibly purposeful, doing it that way.
Now, what can you tell us about either the reaction from Southern newspapers or Southern readers? And the syndicate's reaction to that reaction. Can you give us a little bit of context about all of that?
Yeah, the real sticking point is, as far as I found, the 1968 introduction of Franklin was largely, I would say universally from the coverage I found from that year, embraced. Franklin, this was a kind of celebrated moment. It was very good spirited and enjoyable. And the real kind of sticking moment was actually a couple of years later when Franklin entered the classroom with Peppermint Patty. And 1970 seems kind of late, I think, in folks' minds today to be thinking about school integration. Brown versus Board was back in 54 and 55, but the reality was, especially in the Deep South, 1970 is still in the heat of the battle over school integration and busing and things like this, and so Franklin enters the classroom. There is no, we don't see any sign of picketers out front. We don't see any special security forces or anything like that, like at Little Rock and other places. Franklin just very naturally sits at the front of the classroom in front of Peppermint Patty, and the reaction that I found came largely from Southern newspaper editors, in particular a series of newspaper editors in Mississippi, who wrote to the syndicate to say, we in the context that we're in, as controversial as this issue is right now, and the fact that it is dealing with a very sensitive subject, which is people's children, we can't run these strips. And so I could not pinpoint exactly how many, but there were a number of Southern newspaper editors that actually elected not to run Peanuts on the days in which Franklin would appear in the classroom with the white children. Now, this was brought to Schultz's attention, and it was suggested that maybe for the sake of not rocking the boat too much, that maybe he would want to rethink or maybe approach this a little differently. And this is where the kind of deeply entrenched beliefs of Charles Schulz came out, in which he very succinctly told his editor, he says that either we run it the way I wrote it, or I stop doing it. Meaning I stopped doing Peanuts.
I think that's just one of the great courageous moments in Schulz's career, if I may say so. And I'd like to actually read that because I have it in front of me.
Yeah.
He was responding to his editor, someone named Larry Ruttman at a syndicate. And I guess he was indicating that maybe Schulz should tone it down and not do this. Now, Schulz, who was really very deferential to authority, he respected hierarchy, he respected authority, but he, according to your book, he wrote back. I'm not sure if he wrote back or he told him this, but he said, quote, "Well, Larry, let's put it this way. Either you print it just the way I draw it or I quit. How's that?" And I mean, I can't emphasize enough how uncharacteristic of Charles Schulz that is. So he obviously felt very strongly about this, and he was not going to back down. Now, ironically, I think you'll agree with this, that Franklin was one of his shakiest forays into political content in Peanuts.
Yeah.
And it's one of the few times in the book where you are pretty critical of Schulz.
Yeah.
You wrote, "No single personality could carry the burden of representing a people. This is why Harriet Glickman had advised Schulz in her first letter that if he were to integrate Peanuts, there should, quote, be more than one black child. They needed to, quote, be as adorable as the others," she insisted. "But most of all, they needed to be as diverse as the people they represented. Schulz did not listen, and Franklin stood alone." That's you writing. Can you talk a little about why you think the character of Franklin was such a failure? Because he never acquired any distinctive attributes, except sadly for being the black character in Peanuts.
Right. I think that in the context of the chapter, one of the things that I was that I think Schulz was up against was the fact that Franklin, in many ways, wasn't just a major step in integrating comic arts at that time, or it probably be more accurate, kind of reintegrating comic arts, because there always had been black characters, but there was a real rethinking during the civil rights movement of how black characters had been represented, and there was especially in mass media, there was sort of a stepping back away from black characters in the mid 60s because no one was really sure how, or if they wanted to risk their reputation or no one wanted to risk the controversy of getting it wrong. And so Schulz is taking a big step, but Schulz's character, Schulz always felt that Franklin had to be sort of a standard bearer, Franklin is a character with straight A's. He doesn't have the troubles in math and academics that his classmate Peppermint Patty does. He often has wise advice, oftentimes translated through stories that he's been told by his grandfather. But I think because Schulz tried to sort of make Franklin a sort of ideal representation of Black America, that he was always reluctant to give, in part, to Franklin the kind of character flaws that made the other characters, right? Each of the, of course, Charlie Brown is a character made up almost entirely of flaws, except maybe for his loyalty and his optimism. But you
get virtues, yeah.
Yeah. But so many of the characters are kind of these varying amalgamations of hubris and some virtue and some insecurities. And Franklin never really has any of those. And so it makes Franklin oftentimes seem a bit, yeah.
It just occurred to me with what you said and how you described all the other characters that I always thought all of his characters reflected some aspect of him. Loving music and insecurity and so forth. Yep. And maybe with a Black character, he could not get past that. He couldn't impose some of his own. And it almost looked like, based upon what I read in your book, it almost looked like he felt duty bound to do it, but he was never entirely comfortable doing it.
Yeah. I think that's true, and you can see it not in certainly in the reluctance he expressed in trying to figure out how he might do it, but you can also see it in one of the things I do in the chapter is break down a comparison, because Franklin is created in the same span of years where we also get Peppermint Patty, we get Marcy, some of these characters, and it seems from the way that that Schulz deployed those other characters that there was much more of a comfort, and he talked about throughout his career. The way he would write stories or the way he would write strips is to actually think about, he viewed the stories kind of emanating from the characters themselves, right? So a character has a particular personality and a particular way of looking at the world, and the joke, the story kind of emanates from how they would look at a situation. And so I think you can see a real comfort in writing characters like Peppermint Patty and Marcy that wasn't always there, try as he might, with Franklin. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Peppermint Patty and Marcy. You also wrote that those two characters became important symbols in lesbian publications against Schulz's wishes. Can you talk a little about that? Maybe you can talk about Peppermint Patty and Marcy and what you know of how and why he created those, and then how they became these symbols that he wanted no truck with.
Yeah, right. Well, that's I think in that way, Peppermint Patty and Marcy really kind of reflect, or I would say are great examples of exactly what happened with Peanuts, which is that these characters, while they were very intimately parts of Schulz's personality and his ways of thinking about the world and things like this, they become so big and so ubiquitous that the audience really kind of takes on these characters and carries them with them, sometimes in directions that Schulz never intended, and I think this is kind of common with any popular art, but Schulz's work was just on a really kind of exclusive plane as far as just the visibility of it. Peppermint Patty, I love the creation story of Peppermint Patty. He says, Schulz says he was passing through his office there, and there was a bowl of the candy sitting on the table, and it just occurred to me, what a funny cartoon name that would be, Peppermint Patty. And so, which is really funny because one of his very first characters back in 1950 had been another character named Patty, a different character named Patty.
That's right.
Yeah. And, but so he says, this idea struck me, and he said, I felt like it was such a funny idea that I better go ahead and incorporate some character into the strip, or someone else was going to take it. Someone else would come up with it. And so Peppermint Patty begins life as a great name in search of a character. But the character that he develops is really such a unique character, because she is so comfortable and confident in who she is when it comes to athletics, when it comes to she has a very kind of tomboyish personality. And she's so comfortable in that, in the spaces where she can be that. But it's in all of the other spaces, like romance or the school dress code, or all of these other spaces where she kind of chafes and experiences this real insecurity and crisis of identity. And then here is her counterpart, Marcy, who is super smart, incredibly loyal to Peppermint Patty, incredibly deferential to Peppermint Patty. And Peppermint Patty seems to, at various times, sort of value this relationship, but at other times kind of undervalue this relationship and almost be a bit annoyed by her presence. And so in this complicated relationship, there were a number of readers in the audience who really saw their own discomfort in childhood, the feeling, the experiences of growing up and kind of feeling very comfortable about some of the things about who they were, but then running up against a society that said, no, you shouldn't be this way. And that could be, I think today that's kind of expressed in the language of kind of queer culture, in that this could mean a lot of different things, a lot of different aspects of your identity and the way you approach the world. And so there is a kind of subculture that develops, and it's really gone mainstream. We see it in things like like popular cartoons like the Family Guy. Saturday Night Live makes reference to these, so there is this kind of subculture of fans who view Peppermint Patty and Marcy as sort of these unspoken heroes of their own challenges and courage in coming out and facing the world as themselves. And that subculture has really become quite mainstream. It's not difficult to find that interpretation all over pop culture today, even though that was an interpretation that Schulz personally was not exactly comfortable with. Now he never exactly stakes these things out, and of course he would not have thought about these characters, I don't think, as sexual beings or anything of the sort. But his audience really picked up on some of those possibilities, and it was very meaningful and important.
And I guess in a way they projected their own needs and their own preferences and their own identities onto these characters.
Yeah.
We do have a question. Somebody actually said right before we started talking about this, she always, Peppermint Patty always said she had a crush on Charlie Brown. Did that inconvenience any of the interpretation that she might have been, that her relationship with Marcy was?
That's a great question, because there's
complicates it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always this kind of tension there. Of course, Charlie Brown. Some of the great kind of classic scenes here are Charlie Brown and Peppermint Patty sitting under the tree. Right, they're both leaning up against a tree, and she would be talking about these things, and Charlie Brown is kind of oblivious to the fact that she's meaning him, right? Or she'll call him up and invite him to, a school event or something like that, and he's always kind of oblivious, because many times he sees, he's obsessed with the little red-haired girl. And so kind of oblivious to Peppermint Patty. My interpretation on that is that I don't and the interpretation that I've read from folks that view this Peppermint Patty as sort of a lesbian character is that it's one, not unusual, especially in childhood, with a society that's pressuring certain norms to attempt to fit into some of those molds, and we see in other cases where, like for example, with the school dress code scene, where Peppermint Patty does actually try out wearing a dress, and she just can't stand it. She can't do it, but she does try to fit it. So I think it's some level there, and also I think it's very reasonable that Peppermint Patty, if she were going to try to fit into these norms, that she would choose a rather kind of non-threatening friend like Charlie Brown to explore that type of relationship with, because Charlie Brown's not going to be the type to really rain on anyone else's parade. He's got enough rain on his parade as it is. So,
yeah. And I mean, there was such a complete absence of any sexual
right
intonations in the strip.
Mm-hmm. Right,
that,
absolutely.
Of course, that allows you to impose your own on the blank slate.
Mm-hmm.
We only have a couple minutes left. I did want to ask you a tough question, which is probably unfair, given that we don't have that much time. But what prompted this was I wanted to talk about Vietnam. We really don't have a lot of time to talk about that. But did you make? I mean, I was surprised that you found so much that was political in the book, because when I interviewed him, I created categories. And politics was, as I think you pointed out in the epilogue in the book, it was the shortest file I made. So you dug out a lot more politics than I did, much to your credit. But did you make a distinction between the political content that you could argue was purposeful, that he intentionally put in, versus political content that was simply part of the zeitgeist that he himself did not intend to put in as a political statement, as I think he did with his Christian
right
content. And Snoopy and the Red Baron, and your very determined analogy between the Vietnam War and that brought that to mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that there is a real distinction between the two. One of the things that I get into in one of, I believe the last chapter, is some of the ways that presidential campaigns of the 1970s in various initiatives from Nixon to Ford to Carter and then to Reagan kind of integrate the popularity of Peanuts into various elements of their own political agendas. And Schulz being the sort of patriotic-minded, duty-bound sort of individual, was very honored to contribute in various ways to each of these administrations. And in some cases, those expressions and those administrations, those larger campaigns, really probably went in directions that Charles Schulz personally would not have advocated for. And so kind of a larger message of the book is really the ways that we in American culture kind of take some of these popular images and subsume them into and repurpose them in our political language, in the way that we discuss things. One of the things in the epilogue, I end with a cartoon from last year, using about the coronavirus pandemic and the question about, should we reopen or should we not? Is it safe yet? Should we not? And the artist kind of uses the metaphor of Charlie Brown deciding whether he should trust Lucy and kick the football or not. And it takes 25 seconds for me to explain all that context, but in this imagery, that this metaphor that Schulz had, this trope that Schulz has invented, we can instantly, right, at a glance, we can understand, and it expresses all the complicated feelings and different dynamics going into this. So in a lot of ways, I guess my ultimate argument is that whether Schulz intended it or not, his characters, his motifs, his ideas have infiltrated the way that we continue to process the social and political issues of our world.
Right. And there's the intentional fallacy. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not determinative.
Right.
Just simply based on on what he intended to do. Well, I think that's a great way to end this conversation. We've hit our time limit, but your book certainly explores that subject, with such keen observation and intelligence. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much.
So thanks for this conversation.
And on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank both of you as well. This has been such an enjoyable conversation to listen to. Who doesn't love peanuts? It's been so interesting to dive a little deeper into it. So thank you so much, Professor Ball, for your research. And thank you again, Gary, for coming on to moderate tonight and being part of the program. I want to thank the audience as well. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your questions. If you are interested in diving deeper into this discussion, you can click the link in the chat and purchase the book through Third Place Books, so we can keep that support a local bookstore. Hopefully, we'll see you both sometime in the future. But until then, I hope that you stay safe and have a great night.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.